Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will come to order. We're meeting today to discuss the execution of the President's executive order banning Russian seafood imports. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and keeps members on schedule. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the subcommittee by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess at the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our fully in-person hearings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. All right. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. We're going to just hold off for one moment to wait for Ranking Member Benz before we go any further. So if everyone can just bear with me, we will get going as soon as Ranking Member Benz joins us. Do we have any indication for when Ranking Member Benz will be with us?
Congressman, this is Laura. He is voting right now, and sorry, he was voting, so it's going to be a few minutes.
Okay, good. Well, we're just going to recess then for whatever time it takes for Mr. Benz to join us, and we will resume when he gets here.
Mr. Chairman, it's good to see your handsome self.
Well, it's good to be seen. Thanks, Mr. Fulcher. Good afternoon, everyone. The Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee is back in session. Ranking Member Benz, I apologize that we had some confusion in the hearing room, and on my remote video, we weren't clear that you were not with us, and so we started the hearing and then recessed. But I understand that we are ready to go. I won't repeat all of the prefatory statements I made to begin the hearing. I will just recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Last month, President Biden issued an executive order banning the import of Russian seafood, one of many sanctions we've put in place in response to the unprovoked, unjustified aggression, war crimes, and atrocities of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. The United States imported more than $1.2 billion of crab, cod, and other fish from Russia in 2021. Banning those imports is intended to ensure that American consumers are not funding Putin's war machine. While I fully support the president's goal, I regret to inform the president and all of you that this well-intentioned ban won't work. Not under current laws and policies, not under the less than watchful eye of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And here's why. As we've heard repeatedly in this committee, NOAA only requires transparency and traceability for 13 species groups through its Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, representing only about 40% of the species imported into the United States. SIMP requires importers to track fish from the initial catch throughout the supply chain into their entry into the United States. There is no requirement for traceability for the remaining 60% of the species entering our markets, which includes most of the seafood originating in Russia, including pollock. So while the executive order in theory is supposed to block seafood imported directly from Russia, how will it actually work if most of that seafood is not required to be tracked under SIMP? It actually gets even more complicated. Russia sends a significant amount of seafood to China for processing, hiding the true origins. In fact, 26% of the fish caught in Russia is already sent to other countries for processing, making it a product of the other country. Unless that fish is one of the 13 species that happen to be covered by SIMP, and we know most of them are not, the Russian origins of this seafood is untraceable, and the ban is impossible to enforce. But if NOAA required SIMP for all species, we could ban all seafood imports from Russia. Until that happens, Russian seafood will continue to line grocery store shelves in the United States, and American consumers will continue unwittingly supporting Putin's war machine. The ineffectiveness of the Russian seafood ban is just one example of the many reasons why I and others have long advocated for NOAA expanding SIMP to cover all species imported into the United States. In fact, when NOAA first developed the SIMP program to address illegal fishing, seafood fraud, and slave labor in the seafood supply chain, they explicitly stated in the final rule that they plan to expand the program to cover all species. Since then, story after story demonstrates the need to expand, but NOAA consistently refuses to do so. Even more disappointing, NOAA refused to testify at this hearing today. They won't act, and apparently they don't want to talk to Congress about why they won't act. During my tenure as chair of the subcommittee, we've had several hearings highlighting the need for full transparency and traceability of all seafood entering the United States to make sure that it's not resulting from IUU fishing, from fraud or slave labor in the supply chain, and it's not being sold in our supermarkets and restaurants, undercutting American fishermen. The bill I introduced alongside Congressman Graves, H.R. 3075, would do just that. The America Competes Act includes critical components of our bill, and it must be enacted, especially given NOAA's resistance to acting and their blatant disregard for appropriately dealing with these issues, despite everything that we've learned over the years. At one of our hearings, we heard from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ian Urbina, who told us about a Cambodian migrant who was held captive on a trawler at sea for 3 years, shackled by the neck, and forced to catch fish destined for American shelves. NOAA was at that hearing. They heard it, and yet they've done nothing. We've learned about the deadly secret of China's fishing vessels illegally fishing in North Korean waters, violently displacing smaller North Korean boats, killing fishermen, catalyzing a more than 70% crash in the once abundant squid stocks. Squid, of course, is one of the species that NOAA does not include in the SIMP program. And so we continue to import all of this through China, and yet NOAA has not acted. We've learned that the Department of Labor identified 68 seafood species produced by slave or child labor that we continue to import into the United States. But SIMP only covers 12 of those seafood species, and still NOAA has not acted. We've learned that SIMP covers only 29% of seafood imports from China, China being a notorious bad actor. Almost 60% of offenses in the industrial fishing sector are related to Chinese-owned vessels, according to a new study. But despite pressure from both sides of the aisle to be tougher on China, NOAA has not acted. Finally, we learned that SIMP doesn't cover many Russian seafood products like pollock and salmon. Even though Russia is engaged in IUU fishing, government reports estimate that over 16% of seafood imports from Russia were obtained through illegal fishing. But I think you know, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, NOAA has not acted. Seafood traceability is imperative for preventing the illegal importation of Russian-derived, often IUU-related seafood into the United States. NOAA must immediately take steps to expand SIMP so that we can keep slave-caught, illegal, and Russian seafood out of this country and stop funding Putin's atrocities. I'm eager to discuss this critical and timely topic, and I look forward to the invaluable testimony of our invited witnesses. As noted, it is regrettable that NOAA chose not to appear before the committee today, but I do appreciate those of you who care enough about this issue to join us in this hearing. And with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your understanding of the challenges in getting votes done in what appears to be a fly-out day. The main focus of today's hearing is on President Biden's executive order that sought to stop Russian seafood imports as one of the many consequences of its invasion of Ukraine. The executive order, however, allows Russian-caught seafood to be imported into the United States if it is processed in another country. The late Dean of the House, Don Young, introduced legislation aimed at ending this processing allowance, and unfortunately that legislation is stuck in the Ways and Means Committee. While the Russian seafood ban is subject to trade laws in another committee's jurisdiction, this hearing is being used as a means to justify the proposed legislative expansion of the seafood import monitoring program, otherwise called SIMP. SIMP is a risk-based traceability program aimed at discouraging illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU, seafood and misrepresented seafood from entering the U.S. market. Like Russian seafood or Chinese processed Russian seafood, I don't know anyone here who supports illegal fishing, fraudulent seafood, or seafood produced through forced labor. But the question is whether expanding SIMP is the right way to stop these kinds of practices. NOAA has conceded, quote, SIMP does not prevent or stop IUU fish and fish products from entering U.S. commerce, end quote. Unfortunately, we are unable to hear from the agency, NIMS, about this since NIMS declined to participate today. I join the chair in expressing my dissatisfaction with their refusal to show up. One witness here today, Mr. Mike Lahar, who is testifying on behalf of the National Custom Brokers and Forwarders Association of America, also questions the effectiveness and efficacy of expanding SIMP. As a custom broker, he knows firsthand about how this program is being carried out and will focus his testimony on the extensive and incredibly burdensome documentation process created by SIMP. He will also say that SIMP will not have an impact on the Russian seafood ban. We have also heard from inland aquaculture producers that SIMP expansion will impact them through WTO sufficiency requirements brought on by added SIMP requirements. Lastly, our former colleague from Alaska, late Mr. Young, also opposed this, saying, and I quote, "Although I have long supported the goal of fighting IUU fishing in foreign fisheries and leveling the playing field for U.S. seafood producers, SIMP is not up to the task. This program should be reformed, not expanded," end quote. With the state of Alaska producing 60% of this nation's seafood, we should be careful about passing such measures while we await the arrival of Mr. Young's successor. It seems to me that one of the goals here is to know the country of harvest. With all the issues that we have heard and will hear today with SIMP expansion, we need to look at how finding country of harvest can be done without undue burdens. I'm told that the Department of State's Turtle Excluder Program requires importers to certify that shrimp shipments come from countries that have committed to using turtle excluder devices. Importers must identify the country of harvest in their paperwork, regardless of where the product was processed. So we ought to be looking at examples such as this. Mr. Chairman, when we import at least 85% of our seafood, and when we have a looming food crisis because of the unholy combination of the Russian-Ukraine war, drought, and restrictions on too narrow allowances of the use of federal water policies, we need to clearly produce more food in our country. We need to unleash both aquaculture and agriculture producers, not handcuff them. But that's sadly what's happening. Take, for example, what's now pending in the Klamath Basin, where the Bureau of Reclamation could release water for over 170,000 acres for farmers, but is yet to make a choice about delivering water to farmers or holding it back for higher lake levels. Food independence is a part of our essential national security program. It's something that we all must support. We just have to work together to figure out how to achieve that goal. With that, I yield back and welcome today's witnesses.
I thank the ranking member. We will now hear testimony from our witnesses. Let me remind the witnesses that under committee rules, you should limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be entered into the hearing record. When you begin the timer, we'll start counting down. It turns orange when you have 1 minute remaining, and I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely lock the timer so that it remains visible. I'll remind non-administration witnesses that you're encouraged to participate in the witness diversity survey we've created through the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to your hearing invitation for more information about that. After your testimony is complete, please do remember to mute yourself to avoid inadvertent background noise. I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to the members for questions. So we'll hear first from Ms. Sally Ozell, Senior Fellow and Director of Environmental Security at the Stimson Center. The chair now recognizes Ms. Ozell for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name, as you said, is Sally Ozell, and I'm the Director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center, a nonpartisan research organization in Washington, D.C. First, let me commend Congressman Huffman and the subcommittee for holding this emergency hearing on seafood traceability and the ban of Russian seafood, and for your continued leadership on these important issues. Today is day 43 of the devastating Russian war on Ukraine. We have all witnessed the unspeakable atrocities taking place daily, causing the greatest humanitarian crisis in Europe since World War II. President Biden has rallied nations around the globe to impose sanctions on Putin for his egregious actions. In the U.S., a whole-of-government effort is underway to impose import bans on energy products, technology, Russian vodka, and diamonds. And as Secretary Yellen said last week, we will continue to target Putin's war machine with sanctions from every angle until this senseless war of choice is over. In March, the President signed an executive order banning the importation of Russian seafood, which I expect will be with us for quite some time. Unfortunately, this plan to strike an economic blow to Russia via seafood sanctions to the U.S. won't be successful if we don't close the loopholes that exist across the seafood supply chain. To ensure sanctions are successful, we need full seafood traceability with real information on the origin of catch, and NOAA has an opportunity to be a leader in that effort. Since 2014, Russian seafood exports to the U.S. have grown by 173%. Last year, Russian exported $1.2 billion worth of crab, cod, pollock, salmon, and other fish to the United States. However, the full extent of seafood caught by Russian vessels and sent to U.S. markets goes well beyond those products imported directly from Russia. Under the U.S. Country of Labeling Act, or COOL, seafood products harvested in one country and then processed into another are labeled as a product of the country where the processing occurs. This means Russian seafood processed in China and sent on to America is labeled as Chinese product, not Russian. The U.S. imports about 85% of its seafood, and roughly 35% of U.S. seafood consumed is initially caught in U.S. waters, exported to Asia for processing, and then re-imported back into the United States. Russian catch is processed alongside the U.S. fish, where it is commingled together and processed into fish blocks, fish sticks, canned salmon, or frozen fillets, and then sent back to grocery stores and restaurants here. In fact, according to the ITC, 1/3 of processed wild-caught fish imported to the U.S. from China in 2019 was actually caught by Russian vessels. This includes 69% of Atlantic cod imports and 50% of Alaskan pollock, and so don't let that name fool you. And a recent paper out of the University of Florida found that 39% of the processed salmon imported from China came from Russia. When it comes to rebranded Russian catch, American consumers do not want to buy it, and chefs do not want to serve it. Fortunately, stopping the importation of Putin's pollock is an easy fix. NOAA has the ability to impose traceability requirements which track all seafood through the supply chain before it enters our country. In 2016, the IUU Fishing and Seafood Fraud Task Force created a seafood import monitoring program known as SIMP, which is managed by NOAA. As a former co-chair of the task force, I can state with certainty that while the program initially targeted 13 species groups considered at highest risk of being IUU, the intention was always to expand SIMP to cover all species and prevent illegally harvested seafood from entering U.S. markets. If properly implemented and enforced, SIMP would provide the tools to identify and track the origin of seafood imports, including imports that may have been caught by Russian vessels. Yet after 4 to 5 years, SIMP covers only about 40% of U.S. seafood imports and does not cover several Russian-caught species like pollock, salmon, and halibut. So when fish is processed in China, we really have no idea if it is Russian or not. But Chinese processors can accommodate these full traceability requirements. They already separate out seafood to comply with the European Union's catch certification scheme. And with Europe's proposed ban announced yesterday, they will be able to comply. There are many options to expand SIMP to all species immediately. The President could issue an executive order tomorrow. NOAA could show its leadership and propose an emergency rule. Congress could pass the bipartisan SIMP provisions included in the House American Competes Act and appropriate the funding needed for NOAA to adequately implement a robust SIMP. In closing, if SIMP were expanded to cover all species, the ban on Russian seafood imposed by the President could be implemented effectively and stop Putin's pollock from entering the U.S. It could also provide consumers, retailers, and restaurants with the confidence that the seafood they buy is not supporting the horrific war in Ukraine and give American importers the certainty they need to ensure they are not culpable of importing banned Russian product. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members, for your commitment on this issue, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ozell. We will hear next from Dr. Tabitha Grace Mallory, founder and CEO of the China Ocean Institute. The chair recognizes Dr. Mallory to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Benz, and members of the House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Tabitha Mallory. I run a consulting firm that conducts research on Chinese ocean and fisheries policy, and I'm also part-time at the University of Washington. I appear before you today to address banning Russian seafood imports into the U.S. and the role that China plays in this trade and how the U.S. can best respond in terms of improving seafood traceability. The ban is important not only because of the unjust Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also for stopping flows of unsustainable seafood from Russia into the United States. However, the U.S. still imports seafood from China that is of Russian origin, but passed through China for processing. The goal of seafood traceability is to improve the sustainability and legality of catch and to mitigate criminality and fraud. Seafood traceability is an important tool for stopping IUU fishing, which causes up to an estimated $50 billion annually in losses. Ultimately, we're going to need a fully electronic, globally interoperable seafood traceability system that uses blockchain technology because seafood trade is so global in nature. But for now, the US is still likely importing IUU catch. According to one index in 2021, China scored the highest in the world on measures of IUU fishing, and Russia scored the second highest. In the same year, the US imported $1.76 billion in seafood from China and $1.21 billion in seafood from Russia. SIMP requires information about only 13 types of fish. Russia is a good example of the challenge here. In 2021, the US imported 50 million kilograms of seafood from Russia. Approximately 91% of those imports by value were crab. Of the crab imports, 62% of them were not covered by SIMP. And then of the remaining imports, none of those species were covered by SIMP either, including ground fish such as pollock. Russia and the United States account for 94% of global product production, and pollock sourced from Russia is much more likely to be of illegal and unreported origin. About 89% of Chinese imports of pollock are raw material coming from Russia to be processed. China does not have any pollock fishing of its own. And the US also sends pollock raw material to China for processing, and then those final products are re-imported back into the United States. So if we analyze the US trade data using mandated yield ratios, this is the percentage of material retained after processing, raw imports of pollock caught by the US fleet cannot account for all of the processed pollock that is re-imported back to the US. So depending on the year, anywhere between 30 and 65% of pollock imports into the US from China are actually from Russia. So even though the US has stopped buying pollock directly from Russia, we're still buying it indirectly through China. And it is currently impossible to know whether the processed pollock was caught by the US or the Russian fishing fleet because country of origin labeling is not required. Labels of processed pollock frequently state that the fish is a product of China, even though the fish was not caught by the Chinese fleet. Salmon is a similar case. I won't go into it, but it's very similar in terms of the processing yields. But another challenge with salmon is that there's not harmonized customs categorization across all countries. So countries record species on product forms differently. So Russia, China, Japan, the US all code the various species of salmon differently. So in terms of policy recommendations, I agree, expanding SIMP to include all aquatic species, starting with the ones that feature prominently in the US processing and re-export trade with China is great. And this will also help stop IUU seafood imports from places like North Korea. We also need to make it mandatory to include country of origin labeling for seafood products, as distinguished from country of consignment for processing purposes, so that we know which country actually caught the fish. And we also need to increase transparency. The US seafood traceability system and trade data are optimized for regulatory traceability and compliance, but not for consumer or civil society information. US seafood trade data should also account for the raw material that is sent to China for processing and then re-imported so that this trade can be better tracked and monitored for IUU fishing risks. A couple people just in this hearing have said that the US imports 85% of its seafood, but the truth is we don't really know how much of that fish was actually caught by the US fleet. And then we also need to work to standardize the customs code for seafood across countries and to increase the granularity to the species level so we can match this information up better too. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mallory. We'll next hear from Mr. Austin Brush, Senior Analyst at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. The chair recognizes Mr. Brush for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to provide testimony in today's hearing. My name is Austin Brush, and I am a Senior Analyst with the Natural Resources Program at C4ADS, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing data-driven analysis and evidence-based reporting on global conflict and transnational security issues. It is a privilege to represent our work on this topic. I appear before you today to discuss the importance of traceability and transparency in global seafood supply chains. Our research suggests that improvements are needed to ensure the U.S. does not inadvertently import seafood linked to IUU fishing, fraud, or other illicit activity. More specifically, I would like to discuss 2 main points: how improving traceability in seafood supply chains is essential to understanding where seafood originates and is processed, and the need for greater transparency in relation to vessel and corporate ownership in order to understand who ultimately profits from the harvest, processing, and sale of seafood. My goal is to illustrate how enhanced transparency and traceability in seafood supply chains can help ensure that American consumers are not unwittingly supporting the Russian economy by purchasing Russian seafood. To my first point, traceability in seafood supply chains is critical for understanding where seafood products originate. This is especially important in the U.S., which imports much of the seafood it consumes. In the absence of enhanced transparency and traceability measures, it remains challenging for American businesses to avoid trading in untraceable or illegal seafood products. In the context of our discussion today about the Russian seafood ban, this question of traceability is of the utmost importance. For example, C4DS recently analyzed the trade of specific groundfish species between the U.S. and China that are not covered by the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP. We discovered that nearly a third of the Chinese companies exporting groundfish products to the U.S. were simultaneously importing groundfish products from Russia. This raises questions about the true origins of Chinese groundfish exports and re-exports entering the U.S. In the U.S., existing traceability measures such as SIMP are intended to prevent the importation of seafood linked to forced labor and other crimes by requiring enhanced reporting for seafood products. However, the gaps in SIMP's coverage leaves the U.S. vulnerable to importing seafood products linked to a variety of illicit or non-compliant activities. SIMP should therefore be expanded to encompass all seafood entering the U.S., as well as chain of custody data, such as information pertaining to all processing facilities and trading companies that interact with the seafood product. These improved requirements would help illuminate seafood supply chains in their entirety, from the point of catch to import. In doing so, American seafood companies and government authorities would be able to prevent Russian seafood from entering the U.S. market with a higher degree of confidence. To my second point, lacking transparency and beneficial ownership disclosure requirements in the seafood industry mean that the people and companies behind key industrial fishing fleets remain relatively unknown. Companies are able to hide their true ownership using complex cross-jurisdictional corporate structures, secrecy jurisdictions, and the use of shell companies. These methods can be used to shield the individuals and companies ultimately profiting from illegal fishing and other violations from meaningful repercussions. In order to ensure compliance with the Russian seafood ban, it will be critical to understand who owns industrial fishing vessels and seafood companies around the world. This is particularly relevant for Russian seafood companies, which are frequently linked to politically exposed persons and potentially sanctioned oligarchs. We are currently screening for potential sanctions risk linked to Russian seafood companies and have already found a number of examples of connections to Russian oligarchs or politicians. For example, we identified a major Russian seafood company that was owned by the son-in-law of a Russian individual who had been sanctioned since 2014. The son-in-law was then sanctioned by the U.S. Department of the Treasury on March 24th, 2022. In response, he sold his ownership stakes in and resigned from at least 2 major Russian fishing companies. Although increasing the transparency of beneficial ownership data is a critical step to ensure true traceability and accountability in the seafood industry, disclosing beneficial ownership is not currently required of most fishing vessels or seafood companies. Just as the Corporate Transparency Act established beneficial ownership reporting requirements for certain businesses, U.S. policymakers should expand SIMP to include beneficial ownership reporting requirements. Without this information, it can be difficult to know which vessels and companies are ultimately owned by Russian individuals. Furthermore, detailed beneficial ownership information is needed to hold the beneficiaries of illicit activity in the seafood industry accountable. And then finally, any beneficial ownership information should be made publicly available in order to support enhanced industry and civil society due diligence within seafood supply chains. To conclude, lacking transparency and traceability is a major obstacle to the successful implementation of the Russian seafood import ban. The expansion of SIMP to encompass all seafood species, chain of custody data, and beneficial ownership reporting is critical to ensuring that Russian seafood cannot enter the U.S. As a major importer of seafood and a leader in effective fisheries management, the U.S. has an opportunity to set the gold standard for transparency and traceability in the seafood industry by implementing these changes. Thank you for the time to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brush. Finally, we'll hear from Mr. Mike Lahar, I believe, Chair of the Regulatory Agencies Committee for the National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association of America. The chair recognizes Mr. Lahar to testify for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I wish to thank you for this opportunity to present testimony on behalf of the National Customs Brokers and Forwarders Association of America. My name is Mike Lahar. I'm a licensed customs house broker working for A.N. Derringer, a customs brokerage firm with over 30 offices based out of St. Albans, Vermont. I ask that my full written comments be considered as I'm summarizing my points for this testimony. The NCBFAA represents over 1,100 licensed customs brokerage firms, filing over 95% of all customs entries, and is at the front line for merchandise entering the United States. The NCBFAA wholeheartedly supports the ban on Russian seafood and sees it as an important measure to demonstrate our solidarity with the Ukrainian people. We are working closely with our clients to ensure full compliance with the ban. We are surprised and concerned, however, that some of the witnesses are using this occasion to call for the immediate and significant expansion of the Seafood Import Monitoring Program, SIMP, a provision contained in H.R. 4521, the America Competes Act. They boldly claim that the Russian ban is meaningless unless the SIMP program is immediately expanded. Yet the SIMP expansion would take years to implement. It would ultimately have no impact on the Russian ban. As customs brokers, we also understand how supply chains work, and we know it is critical to the well-being of the U.S. economy and individual consumers that supply chains are efficient and reliable. Any discussion of seafood trade must recognize that seafood supply chains are long. They are complex. Many are a maze of cross-border movements and interdependencies designed to achieve maximum efficiencies. These supply chains flow in all directions. It is routine and common for seafood caught and landed in one country to be shipped to a third country for processing. In fact, that is the case for many U.S. caught seafood. The International Trade Commission estimates that 11% of imported seafood consists of IUU seafood. This means that 89% of seafood imports are compliant. The challenge for regulators is this: how to stop the 11% without disrupting the vast majority of legal, compliant imports. We need effective enforcement as well as efficient enforcement. Yet NOAA already collects more data at entry than just about any other agency. The 15 required data elements may not seem like a big deal until you consider the complexity of seafood supply chains and the reality of the entry process. So, shall we consider what this means in the commercial world? When a typical shipment of canned seafood arrives in the United States, it may consist of 20 ocean containers holding 60,000 tins. The seafood in these products may have easily originated from 10 or 12 different vessels catching the fish from over 100 different locations. So for this one typical customs entry, 15 additional data elements explodes into thousands of data elements at entry, as all of these variations are accounted for. That equates to 18,000 discrete data elements, each of which must be manually entered and transmitted to NOAA via the CBP ACE system. Now the America Competes legislation doubles down on this approach, calling for a significant expansion of SIMP by requiring complete chain of custody data 72 hours in advance of entry, with verification and certification by a competent third party of all major transfer points. The bill also expands the scope of SIMP by including all species of seafood and seafood products, and widens NOAA's mission by requiring data on labor conditions in the harvest and processing of seafood products. The other witnesses deem this legislation as essential for enforcing the Russian ban and apparently envision this legislation, if passed, taking effect immediately. Yet many, if not most, of these provisions would be impossible to implement for years at best. Ultimately, smarter use of 21st century technology will provide for more streamlined, effective results than relying on voluminous data entry on a shipment-by-shipment basis at the time of entry. Artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and blockchain all offer exciting and innovative opportunities that should be explored. The NCBFAA stands ready to help in this effort. Thank you again for allowing me to present the NCBFAA's perspectives on this matter. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lahar. We will now bring it back to the members for questions, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Lahar, just to pick up where we left off, do you agree that if you are unable to identify the origin of these seafood products, especially products that may have been processed in other countries, it's really not possible for you to enforce this nominal ban on Russian seafood right now?
Well, the ban as it stands is based upon declaration of the country of origin of the goods as imported, correct?
Yes, and so since these products are processed through China and come through as a Chinese product, wouldn't you agree that right now, if we're pretending to ban Russian seafood, you can't do that?
The customs laws, the way they work, if
Yes or no?
products,
Just yes or no, sir. I have limited time. You can't.
no, I disagree that this would limit the ability to track.
So you can, with the tools you have right now, you can ban Russian seafood.
I'm not here to debate economic sanctions. I'm
All
here.
right, I'm gonna reclaim my time and move on to other witnesses. I heard some interesting testimony from Mr. Lahar suggesting that only 11% of the seafood imported into the United States is actually the product of IUU fishing. I have heard dramatically different data from other experts and studies over the years. And so let me just ask our other witnesses if they agree with that statement that we only have an 11% problem when it comes to IUU fishing products being imported into this country.
Mr. Chairman, this is Sally. I would have to say that I do not agree with only 11% because, as Tabitha just said, and I'm sure she can elaborate more, we just don't know. When seafood is mixed and commingled alongside Russian catch and as well as Chinese catch, and we do not know. And also, we do not know if labor and human rights violations are narrowed also to that small window. I mean, as pointed out, Russia and China China is probably the number one on IUU, as well as Russia comes right behind, as well as for labor and human rights abuses. So we do not know when seafood is processed overseas and comes back. It's just an unknown quantity.
Thank you, Ms. Ozell. And you testified unequivocally as someone who was there that at the initiation of the SIMP program, the clear intent was to expand it to all species imported into the United States. Mr. Lahar just testified that this would take years to happen, that it wouldn't make a difference in terms of preventing Russian seafood from entering our markets, and that it's just too hard and complex to really do this. Look, I have a bunch of my own thoughts about that. I think if we only asked federal agencies to do easy things, we'd have a lot less federal agencies with much smaller budgets. Sometimes we need them to do the hard stuff. And I also note that all of these seemingly impossible tracing and tracking things seem to have been accomplished when it comes to seafood entering the European Union. Do they just have better systems than us? Do they have better math? Do they have better agencies? Let me invite both Dr. Mallory and Ms. Ozell to answer that question. Is it just too hard? Can we just not get there from here?
I'll go ahead and say something, Mr. Chairman. This is Tabitha Mallory. So I think I'm actually one of the people that didn't say that we need to just tomorrow expand SIM to all the aquatic species. I think that should be our ultimate goal. But I do think there are bureaucratic challenges, and we could start with the major species that the U.S. imports. So, pollock, salmon, squid, and, these are species that we know have problems also with labor abuses. And another part of this is the transparency in our data. A lot of this data actually exists, but it's not released to the public. And so it's up to people like me to essentially reverse engineer, using yield ratios and just estimating what the actual volumes of trade are, what percentage would be IUU catch. And so I think a combination of increasing transparency, expanding the program, we can get the program in place and get to a place where we want in terms of our knowledge.
So you would start though with expanding SIMP to the targeted species, then develop these other traceability tools, as I understand your testimony, right?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly good way to handle it. I mean, that's what SIM did already. They started with 11 species and expanded it to a couple more. And I assume that they were going to keep expanding to more species gradually.
Right. And Ms. Ozell, you said China already separates seafood to comply with European Union rules, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean,
So
I'm
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead, please.
No, what I was going to say is, with regard to the length of time that Mr. Lahar noted, I mean, we heard from the Joint Chief of Staff yesterday, General Milley, that this war could go on for a very long time. And also, let us not forget that I expect the seafood ban to go on for even longer, much longer. I mean, Russia has banned U.S. seafood for now 8 years. I would think at the very minimum that is what we should do to at least try to level our playing field with our own fishing community and our own fishers. But on the point you mentioned, yes, I agree with Tabitha. You know, we need to let NOAA walk before it can run, but it's now been four and a half years. So Rome was not built in a day, but it's time for them to have a program that is operational. In addition, there is a lot of great technology. We need to enhance technology, barcodes, QR codes, and blockchain, all of which can be implemented, and NOAA is working in that direction, but we should at least get it happening now. We need to be able to track seafood from when it is caught all the way through the seafood supply chain, and we're only going to be able to do that if we move away from paper-based documentation, which can be falsified, to electronic catch documentation, and expand those key data elements required under a SIMP to include transshipment data, beneficial ownership data, vessel tracking, and forced labor data, all of which are noted in your bill, Mr. Chairman, the American Competes Act and the House passed version. So I think we need to also expand enforcement and improve SIMP's programmatic staffing, grow training programs with the brokers and others around the world so that people like Mr. Lahar and others in other countries have training and understanding of what the SIMP program needs. And lastly, I would like to note that, SIMP is aligned with the EU catch certification scheme, and Japan now has a new program. And so as we move forward, we need to have all of these countries aligned because many more are coming on. So I would urge NOAA to work, as I know they are, with other countries to align programs around the world so it's less burdensome to the brokers and to fishers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ozell. I'm going to hand it over to the ranking member with apologies. I owe you some time, Mr. Benz, but let me just conclude that Mr. Brush in his testimony reminds us that oligarchs are very likely the beneficial owners of a bunch of these Russian seafood companies. In so many other ways, we see other federal agencies finding creative ways to track down these oligarch funds, to seize yachts, and just to bring a can-do approach to sanctions. It would be great to see that same can-do approach when it comes to Russian seafood. And with that, I will yield to the ranking member and recognize him.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And near as I can tell from my clock, I have an additional 3 minutes. Is that correct, on top of my 5?
Take whatever you need, Mr. Benz. I took great liberties with the clock a moment ago.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Lahar, we have a number of situations in the forestry space where we ask for the bureaucracy, the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, to do the impossible, and it generally takes them years. And sometimes we ask them to do the possible, it takes years. And so all the time that we're waiting for these good things to happen, the folks that we place these impossible tasks before struggle to try to actually get things done. And in the meantime, the goal that we're trying to achieve remains unresolved. So you mentioned how difficult it would be to make this happen. It was asserted that Europe has somehow taken care of it. Do you agree?
I thank you, Representative Bent. I agree in the way that they do have a program and it's functioning. But the legislation as it stands before the House of Representatives in Bill 4521 requires the certification of major points of transfer of the product back to the harvesters or the growers. And there currently is no program set to allow for that. So just the development and the implementation of setting up the certifying bodies would take years. We just don't have the infrastructure in place to allow us to do that currently. I do agree with Ms. Ozell about the use of new technologies. That's a very interesting and subject, and the NCBFAA really is supportive of that. The current ACE system is limited in the amount of data that it can take, and adding all of this data into the current data flow could literally take the system down. It comes down 2 or 3 times a week currently. It's not designed to do that, but it's just receiving so much data currently that every time it exceeds its capabilities, it goes down, and that leaves our ports of entry open. So while that system is down, we have goods flowing into our country without good results. It's not able to be vetted by Customs Vetting Center. So that leaves us open to terrorism and a lot of other things that could happen. But ACE 2.0, which Customs is working on, leverages these new technologies and would be the ideal opportunity to use things like a blockchain in order to make this a much more robust program. Thank you.
So let me ask you again, Ms. Lahar, as it relates to achieving this outcome, you suggested that the SIMP approach is too burdensome and too time-consuming and not manageable. Do you have some alternatives that would achieve the outcome desired, which appears to be that we would address the pollock issue, at least the salmon issue, at least perhaps the squid? Do you have something in mind that we could do that would allow us to stop Russia from benefiting from the export of these types of commodities?
It's interesting that Representative Huffman mentioned the turtle excluder program. That is one of the ideas that has been mentioned. It's a fairly simple form that importers complete, and it would allow us to address some of these problems without having to immediately address issues like the certifying bodies. There are other programs like FDA's Food Safety Verification Program, where U.S. importers are required to monitor their supply chains. If we could model a system on the turtle excluder or the FSVP program, these are examples that are already out there. They're already working. I would suggest that we may want to look at those before we go ahead and take further action on the SIMP legislation.
So the question, Mr. Lahar, is what can we do right now to affect, damage, hurt, in some way respond to what Russia is doing, which is so wrong? So what can we do now? Because it appears that the suggestion that we use the SIMP program wouldn't result in an immediate impact. Do you have something in mind that we could do quickly?
Like I said, the turtle excluder program is a great example. We have the technology in place right now to require those certificates and to get them into the entry system and stop the importation of Russian originating seafood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Benz. I am not sure. Let me ask staff to tell me the next member in order for questions, please.
Mr. Case?
Mr. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Ozell, sorry. I think there's been allusions to other efforts throughout government that seem to have a better overall understanding of how to pull this off, whether it be the FDA, general traceability, or some of President Biden's efforts on just supply chain, tracking. I mean, this is not the only example where somebody tries to circumvent our rules by routing something through another country. So this ain't new stuff. And certainly it seems to me that we have been down this road before. And so what are the lessons to be learned? I mean, if I understand the testimony here correctly, and I don't frankly know what to make of NOAA's absence here. I think it's unfortunate. I think for me it's uncharacteristic, and I don't know whether NOAA just doesn't have an answer right now or doesn't want to go down this road to start with. But sooner or later we need to hear from NOAA. And the bottom line is that there are other approaches out there. So what's your comment along those lines? Who's doing this right within our government, and how do they answer the concerns, and how can they be instructive to NOAA, who I'm sure is listening?
Yes, thank you, Thank you, Mr. Case. First, you are absolutely right. This is not the first time anyone has had to try to track or trace a commodity in our U.S. system. I mean, timber is an example that has been tracked for years. Oil and gas is traced. You may recall when we were even considering about nutrition labeling. The industry said that was going to kill them. The timber industry said that was going to kill them. Oil and gas said that was going to kill them. Well, guess what? They all seem to be thriving pretty well. So I think the seafood industry does have a chance to be able to take on the lessons learned from some of these previous tracking and tracing programs. But I'd also say, the FDA has proposed a rule that requires supply chain actors to maintain traceability records for almost all seafood products. So importers and their supply chains will soon have a place where traceability systems for almost all seafood products works. And so this should be, make the expansion of SIMP actually easier because industry will already be required to do a significant amount more than they are currently doing on the chain of custody, and it's for health and safety reasons. I mean, we know also, if I could just add, tuna. Tuna is tracked from where it is harvested all the way into the can with a barcode that you and I can look up online to see all of the elements.
Let me just ask you a basic question there. If the FDA is busy doing this right now, then what's the relationship of the FDA's proposed rule applicable to seafood to whether NOAA does or doesn't, proceed on this?
Yeah, that's a great question. It focuses on health and safety. And so it doesn't look at all the other risk issues that perhaps the SIMP
I
program
see.
does.
So they're not factoring in IUU or forced labor or any of the, or for that matter, just a broader.
They aren't, although we are urging them to do so.
But I mean, it's a model that you can easily just apply over, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And I would also add to that FDA and NOAA are working together. I mean, we do have an all-of-government approach, and I would urge them to continue
Okay.
to do so.
Okay. I'm gonna move on just because I have limited time.
Sure.
So Mr. Brush, Mr. Lahar says that, first of all, Mr. Lahar says he fully supports the ban on Russian imports, and he's all into it, and his industry, and I take him at his word on that. We all want to do that. But he says this program is not the right way to do it. And so the question was, well, if this isn't the right way to do it, then what is? And he says the turtle monitoring program. What do you say to that?
I don't have quite as much familiarity with that specific program, but I still fundamentally believe for an effective implementation of the ban, you do need that chain of custody data to be able to follow where those shipments might have come, where they originated in Russia and then went through China to get then to the United States.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying the turtle monitoring program offers half of the solution or some of the solution, but it's not a complete solution.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more information required in these reporting on shipments like that.
Okay, and then same basic question to you then. Is this the right program to go after the basic goal of avoiding circumvention of our ban of Russian seafood? I mean, is there another approach that we can take, or is this just the avenue we should be going down, period?
I mean, from my perspective, I would say yes. I think the data elements are some of the more key angles that I can focus on. You know, the need for chain of custody data, the need for beneficial ownership information. These are critical pieces of data in any kind of investigation or, regulatory work looking at shipments to confirm where they came from and their legality. And so that element of it, that collection of data is where I think it is the most critical and where this program would be able to collect that data.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yield back, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Case. The chair now recognizes Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, hey, first of all, thank you all for. I want to thank the chair for working with us on this. Support for the goals of the bill that we co-sponsored with Don Young to ban imports of Russian seafood. But I also want to be clear that this IUU bill is separate from the Don Young Russian seafood ban bill. And this IUU bill was introduced before all of the Ukraine mess and before Don Young had introduced his bill. So there's the Don Young bill that we're a co-sponsor of on Russian seafood being banned, and then there's the IUU bill that we've co-sponsored with the chair. So I just wanted to distinguish the two. Our IUU bill was introduced, and I don't claim, as you stated in your testimony, that the Russian ban is meaningless unless the SIMP program is immediately expanded. I think they're separate, but they're important pieces of legislation. The goal is to combat slave labor, prevent human rights abuses, protect our resources, and I think provide consumers with a choice. Like, that's really what the objective is there. But in order for them to have a choice, you've got to be able to distinguish. And so the SIMP helps to distinguish what their choices are. And you've got to provide that information to consumers. So Ms. Lahar, similar to what's required of our domestic seafood producers, your testimony points out that additional overhead would be incurred as a result of compliance with traceability and with transparency. We did, with Mr. Huffman, try to make a concerted effort to improve and automate the process, but I'll tell you, I'm all ears in regard to other ideas or feedback on how we can maintain traceability and transparency and accountability while streamlining it. So I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts or reaction on that.
I thank you very much, Representative. I think that's the point. We're rushing forward with this legislation to address the conflict in Ukraine. But this concept is something that has been chugging along, and the NCBFAA has been working with NOAA and suggesting that they talk to the Food and Drug Administration and giving them examples of ways that this could be addressed: blockchain, artificial intelligence. The Food and Drug Administration is doing some wonderful things with artificial intelligence. We have ACE 2.0 that's coming up from Customs that is going to revolutionize the way that we file entries. So I think the key is to look at all of these different things that could be leveraged to do this. But if we rush this legislation through, it may be too late to take some of those actions. So my chief concern is that we pass a bill that would be imperfect on a program that's already been admittedly described as imperfect, when we could make this a much, much better program, much more robust, and stop goods from coming into this country illegally. Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple things. Number one, let's keep in mind, I mean, you talk about rushing through, the bill is largely already passed the House through Competes and Coast Guard, but also this bill was introduced, Mr. Huffman, I want to say spring of last year, right? Didn't we? Yeah, so spring of, I'm sorry?
You are correct.
Okay, so you know, nobody looks at Congress as the model of efficiency, but you know, it's certainly been around for a while, and I don't know that there's any rushing going on. I'll tell you again, I am all ears in regard to ideas that you may have to help to streamline or prevent, you know, additional cost, but still achieving the objective of the traceability, the accountability, the transparency that's there. Because I don't speak for Mr. Huffman, but I think those are our real objectives here, and it also helps to provide the consumer's choice. And the only way they have the choice is if we know some of those some of those facts and are able to communicate to consumers. Look, last, I just want to say that I'm wrapping up. I just want to say that the objective of this bill, we're one of the largest seafood producers in the United States. The objective of this bill of holding countries like China and Russia accountable that have some of the worst illegal fishing fleets in the world, that is unfair competition, it is overfishing, it's lack of sustainable practices, and these are objectives that we should all be sharing. So I want to thank Mr. Huffman again and yield back.
Thanks very much, Representative Graves. Appreciate it. And you know, just a reminder, there actually is some urgency in doing something about the importation of Russian seafood. We've got other federal agencies finding ways to very quickly seize assets, including yachts, and we need to bring that same sense of urgency to the problem of how our seafood import system is actually funding the Russian war machine. So with that, are there any other members in the hearing room that would like to be recognized?
Rattlewagon.
Ms. Rattlewagen, sorry about that. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for holding this hearing on Russian seafood and actions we can take. Thank you both for testifying today, the panel here. My concern with Russian seafood goes back to the end of the Cold War, when I seem to recall Mikhail Gorbachev announcing from Vladivostok that the Soviet Union was a Pacific nation. Mr. Lahar, my questions are for you. As it relates to Russian-caught seafood that is processed in other countries, are there any examples of other programs, I think this was asked earlier, currently in place that track country of harvest without the burdensome requirements of SIMP? You mentioned the turtle excluder program.
Yes, the turtle excluder program as it stands now could be modified in order to fit in with the desire to limit the importation of seafood originating in Russia. Also, the Food and Drug Administration's FSVP program, which requires importers to monitor the supply chain back to the originators, would be another model that could be based that would allow the implementation of a policy to exclude Russian seafood from being imported into the United States.
So as a follow-up, how would SIMP expansion penalize compliant parties in the seafood supply chain?
Well, the ITC study, which is a federally funded study, finds that 89% of seafood imported into the United States is compliant. So we're looking for the 11% of the seafood imports that are coming from bad actors. We're looking at penalizing those 89% of the importers bringing in legitimate and compliant product into the United States to go after those 11%. And it can be quite costly to importers to do that. So it ultimately can go back to the consumer and they will foot the bill for this program.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Mr. Soto, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. In Florida, fish is a big part of our diet, as well as our way of life, with the red snapper, grouper, mahi-mahi, and other major types of fish from our area, Florida lobster. But we also love our salmon, pollock, crab, canned tuna. The New York Times has reported that the fish most likely to sip through our import ban is, in fact, pollock, and that the increase in crab demand has pushed a lot of Russian crab into the market. Fish caught by Russian ships in Russian seas. This is at a time when we're seeing Russia unjustifiably and violently invade Ukraine. And we're all inspired by Ukrainian soldiers fighting for freedom. And I'm proud to be part of that 14 billion in relief that we're helping to support them. But thousands are dead and war crimes have been committed. And so we need to make sure, as we're doing our part with bans on imports like fishing bans, that the least we can do is make our fish stick supply chain more secure to enforce against the Russian fishing ban. I do want to mention first that we also are concerned about Russia's blockade of U.S. fishing rights in the South Georgia Patagonian fishery, which is a key source of Chilean sea bass that we'll take up with commerce. But for today, we know we're looking at traceability. Ms. Ozell, if NOAA made the decision to require all species to be covered under the SIMP program, what would that process look like?
Thank you, Mr. Soto, for that question. NOAA could do this immediately through an emergency regulation. And as I said earlier, the White House could pass and execute an executive order, and Congress could pass the American Competes Act, of course, the House version. So, you know, again, just to reiterate, NOAA has been working hard to get the program right. They've been working to improve SIMP implementation by focusing on technology improvements, using data analytics, increasing audits, adding new species, reducing human trafficking, and these are just a few of the things that they have been doing. However, while they're doing that, they can expand to all species. They've already been doing it for 13 species group. It is not a huge lift to go to all species. And again, it could be an emergency rule, and it could be an emergency rule to focus on first salmon and pollock, and then it could expand to others in the near term. But to affect
Thank
the
you, Ms. Ozell.
Okay.
Dr. Mallory, can you walk through just a little bit for my constituents, China's role in processing seafood that are from Russian waters, Russian fishermen?
For any species or one in particular?
For just generally speaking, actually, let's talk about pollock since that's the most likely one slipping through right now.
Okay, so it's different depending on if it's Russian raw material or U.S. raw material. So Russia generally sends its raw material to China for processing, and then that processed product ends up on usually European and U.S. markets. It doesn't re-import a lot of the processed material. The U.S. is different. The U.S. We have a big pollock fleet. We send our raw material to China for processing and then re-import it. And so, one easy way to actually solve this is, China knows the difference between the pollock that is of Russian origin versus Chinese origin. Actually, China requires, they have a bilateral documentation scheme. They require catch certificates from Russia. So, if we just want to do this fast and required our fish, the fish that's caught by the U.S. fleet, which, the consumer should have a choice. We want Americans buying our seafood. Let's just ask China, let's have our seafood labeled, and China knows the difference. There's some challenges with enforcement because we're not actually there, but that's how the system works.
Thank you, Dr. Mallory. And Mr. Lahar, I'm intrigued by your suggestion about using blockchain. I passed amendments, first identifying through the budget, then requiring reporting, and now a pilot program utilizing blockchain for food traceability. And that pilot program that just was utilized was for romaine lettuce outbreak, which we were able to help solve. So feel free to send my office more information on your suggestion on that. We're now going to go into a much bigger program through USDA, getting into this next 2023 budget. Thanks so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. Ms. Gonzalez-Colon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses that we do have today. I think this is a very important issue, and loopholes should not be a part of that executive order. And in that case, I would love to make a question to Ms. Sally Joseph. You said in your written testimony and pointed out that the executive order banning the importation of Russian seafood contains a major loophole, and we've been talking about that. It does not cover Russian caught fish shipped for processing in other countries like China. My question will be, can you discuss the implication of this loophole? And more than that, why it's so important that we ensure that the ban is expanded to include Russian seafood processed in other countries? And if you can also discuss, what available policies, proposals we need to have to achieve this. For instance, does the administration currently have any the necessary authorities to expand an executive order to include Russian caught seafood processed or substantially transformed in other countries, or do they need legislation to achieve this? I know there are many questions, so feel free to jump on all of them. Ms. Joseph?
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Ozell.
Okay. Yeah, as we've said, already, Russia exports to the United States have grown by 173% since 2014. And Russia is the largest exporter, eighth largest exporter of seafood to the United States. So in order to really figure out how to stop the Russian pollock and the Russian salmon from entering the United States, we really need to be able to have electronic catch verification that tracks seafood all along the supply chain. And that is what, again, they're doing with the European Union. And then when it happens in China, when they're processing, they can literally segregate that. So we have an opportunity and an ability, because it's already being done, to learn from the European Union and how they process seafood overseas so that it reaches those catch verification requirements by the EU. I have to say, I spoke yesterday with a Seattle-based catcher processor who catches crab and cod, and he said that it is easy for us to be able to track seafood, that we do it with tuna, we do it with other species. SIMP is doing it. It's not a heavy lift. And he also suggested that I urge folks, do not over-engineer this, do not overthink this, make it simple, and it's very viable to do. But the key is having it electronically verifiable and having, the technology exists, whether you're a small-scale fisher with a handheld device or a larger scale, you can track your seafood from where it's caught as it moves through the supply chain to when it's transshipped, to when it's processed, and back into the United States. That is what technology has offered us today. 20 years ago, maybe we didn't have it. We have it today, and we should be doing it.
But question, in order to achieve this, this policy that has been used in the European Union, do we need, do the executive power here, the president got the power to ban it and amend the executive order to include this? Or do you believe that we need to have Congress to step up and legislate this?
Well, we have the power as the president issued his executive order to ban Russian seafood. However, to get to the specific details, we either need to have an emergency rule from NOAA, we need Congress to pass, for example, the American Competes Act, which would cover that, or third, we need a new executive order that specifically targets pollock and salmon and says that it should be required under SIMP.
So you understand that it should be addressed two ways: legislation to give more power and specificity, and be specific in the terms of how the fish is caught, and amending the executive order to close that loophole. Thank you, Ms. Joseph, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez-Colon. If there are no other members seeking to be recognized, I will begin a second round of questions and start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. So just to be clear, Ms. Ozell, I'm hearing the suggestion that keeps creeping up that we have to either have SIMP or use all of these fancy technologies that can help us, trace seafood through the processing and supply chain. As I understand it, SIMP is agnostic as to the data and the tools that are used to help us carry out these safeguards. Am I misunderstanding something, or could SIMP use blockchain and all of these other fancy data tools to achieve our policy objective?
Mr. Huffman, you are absolutely correct. SIMP is agnostic and could use many of these new technologies or not so new technologies that have been used. And in fact, they're looking at it. But we need to urge them along to look at it and move forward more quickly. I think as an example, you have authorized in your legislation $20 million a year for NOAA to implement SIMP. That's the kind of funds that my understanding is, would be needed to they could do it now, but I think the kind of funds you provided, they can't say that it's burdensome, they don't have the funding, they don't have the staff, and blah, blah, blah. They can move this forward, and I think your America Competes Act will really help them do that.
Right. I think we're going to have to zero in on pollock a little more, and I appreciate the witnesses who have done that, because it seems to me that one of the reasons they haven't used SIMP is that we have a huge American pollock fleet that relies on China for processing, where all of this fish that gets re-imported into the United States gets commingled with a bunch of other pollock and other fish. And it's burdensome and inconvenient, I suppose, or we are told, to segregate it and trace it. But Ms. Ozell, I missed the exact figure. You're suggesting that there's a significant percentage of what's represented as Alaskan pollock in the American seafood market that is actually Russian pollock. Would you remind me what percentage that is?
Yes. And while I'm just making sure I have the right number, let me also urge that, Mr. Chairman, you might want to reach out again to this member, this catcher processor in Seattle, who is in the, who told me yesterday that, he told me yesterday that much of the pollock industry that is processed, where they have their processing overseas, could be done in the United States. He said it is not a heavy lift. They do it, and that we should bring those jobs back. Because technology has advanced so far, it's not like, cutters like it used to be in the old days. We have technologies that could provide good-paying jobs in America for people to process fish here. We don't have to send it overseas for low-cost labor and human rights violations and whatnot.
I appreciate that. While you're looking for that
I found the number,
statistic,
I'm
though,
sorry. It's 50%,
yeah, go ahead.
50%, roughly 50% of Alaska pollock comes from Russian ships. And
That's
it's called,
just
as I said,
mind-boggling.
Alaskan pollock.
Yeah, thank you for that. Ms. Mallory, can you demystify this a little bit? Is it possible for us to avoid punishing the American pollock fleet, which we support and we want to be successful, while still having some commonplace protocols in place to prevent importation of Russian pollock and other seafood?
Yes, I think it would actually be in our interest to differentiate. I mean, already now we require, like, we actually don't allow Russians to call their pollock Alaskan pollock. So if we're able to do that, I mean, I think we just need to ask that we have the product differentiated, have it labeled. I mean, if you've ever tried just to go online, on Amazon even, to buy pollock and you want it from the US fleet, a lot of the sales on there, there doesn't indicate what country it comes from. And the volume switches from year to year. The amount of pollock that ends up in the US that's from Russia, it just, it fluctuates based on how much was produced.
Do you agree, Dr. Mallory, that using the SIMP program and using blockchain and other technologies that you've alluded to are not mutually exclusive? They can go together. You can expand the number of species covered and use cutting edge tools to feed the data into the program. Is that correct?
Yes, I agree. I think, it's just, we just have to ask for what we want.
Thanks very much. Yield back, and I'll recognize Ranking Member Benz for 5 minutes. If the ranking member is unavailable, let me see if there are any other members that would like to be recognized at this point. And seeing none, we are done. So let me thank our witnesses very much and thank the members for really thoughtful questions. This is an important hearing, and I think we have shed some light on a subject that absolutely deserves and requires it. So my thanks to all of you. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and we'll keep the record open for 10 business days to allow for responses to those questions. If there's no further business, then without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.